Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We now enter the final part of our discussion of the world in 1492. Actually, we're pretty well beyond 1492 at this point, but we're going to be talking about the origins of English settlement before moving on in our next chapter to talking thoroughly about English settlement in the Americas. Now, as I mentioned at the end of the previous lecture, between 1492 and the early 1600s, other European nations had made major inroads in settling in North America. I described the Spanish, who were settling in the south and then throughout the west. I talked about the French, who were settling in what is today Canada, the Great Lakes region, and eventually sort of making their way down in the upper Midwest. And the Dutch with their settlement around what is today New York, at that time New Amsterdam. And so the English colonies, as we're going to be talking about them in the Chesapeake and in New England, were really kind of what was left over after these other nations had already begun their process of settlement. And if we think about it in terms of rivers and potential passageways across the continent to the Pacific, the English are essentially going to be hemmed in. And we're going to be talking about that in future lectures, how they will have to sort of break through the settlement of these other nations. But that will come a little bit later. For the moment, we need to talk about the process whereby the English actually do start to get involved. They are certainly late coming to this sort of race for the New World, coming a century or more after groups like the Spanish had been coming. So we need to talk a little bit about why they're so slow in getting to the process, and then, of course, why they do eventually start to join in. So part of the answer to this is that through the late 16th century, the late 1500s, England was insular in nature. It is an island, and people in England lived a relatively isolated life with relatively little contact with other parts of the world when we compare them to the great seafaring nations like Portugal, Spain, Italy, and then to some extent the French. England was mired in difficulties through much of that period. You're thinking about things like the plague, which ravaged the English population, religious wars, and internal dissent. So it was very difficult for the English to really envision heading out across the ocean to another part of the world when they frankly found it difficult just to stay alive on their own little island of England. Now that starts to begin to change as we get into the late 1500s, heading toward the early 1600s, when the English do start to get involved. And there are a number of factors related to this that we want to talk about. So some of them are what we might call push factors. These are things going on within England itself that are going to inspire people to want to leave or almost force them to leave. And then we'll talk about some pull factors, which are things outside of England that will begin drawing people to move away from the island. So, in terms of push factors, things that are happening in England itself encouraging people to leave. Well, one of them is population growth. Now, I mentioned the plague, which ravaged England through much of the late 1400s, early 1500s. As they start to recover from the plague, between 1550 and 1600, the population of England roughly doubles. And so you're talking about twice as many people for the same amount of land and the same amount of resources. So obviously that's going to put many people in a hard way trying to have enough food and resources to survive. And so many people who perhaps can are going to start to think about going elsewhere to find what they need. Another factor, and somewhat related to that, is what were known as the Enclosure Acts, which were a series of laws being passed in the 1500s in England, which allowed landowners to convert their lands from farmlands to raising sheep. It also, incidentally, allowed them to begin building walls and fences to kind of separate their land from someone else's land. And prior to that, there was an extensive population in England that just kind of migrated around and sort of lived off the land. Those people now became known as cotters, C-O-T-T-E-R-S, a landless laborer. In many cases, they were regarded as vagrants. They were sort of homeless, had nowhere to go. And some of these people are eventually going to be sent away from England. Now, there are other push factors that are encouraging people to leave. Many of the early migrants come from the gentry class looking for investments abroad. They're going to be looking for new ways to make money. As we're going to talk about, some of these are the second and third sons of noblemen who really they're not going to inherit anything according to English law, and so they might be able to find opportunities abroad. And a final factor is religious conflict within England. And these conflicts sort of go back and forth among various different groups. Oftentimes, malcontents might not have been killed, but their lives were made miserable. They were persecuted and picked on, and many of them decide to leave. And we're going to talk more about some specific examples of that when we get into our discussion next time about the earliest English settlement. So what about pull factors, things outside of England that were drawing potential English settlers to leave? Well, again, there are a number of them. One of them related to the Protestant Reformation. England was a Protestant country, and Spain became one of England's great rivals as the chief Catholic country. English foreign policy through much of the 1500s was driven by a need to expand and protect itself from the Catholic Spanish. So English merchants throughout this period would plunder Spanish shipping. We would call this piracy. According to the English of that time, this was just fair game. These were their enemies. In 1588, the Spanish grew tired of these tactics on the seas and sent the powerful Spanish Armada to attack the English. The English, in one of the great upsets in world history, destroyed the Spanish Armada, actually with the help of a major storm that damaged or destroyed many of the powerful Spanish ships. But at that moment, 1588, the English now became free to explore the seas because the Spanish were no longer there to dominate and control everything. So they're going to begin turning their attention abroad. Another factor was the fall of the Antwerp wool market in 1551. The English economy was almost entirely reliant on one product, wool. And in 1551, the market in Antwerp crashed. It was just over-flooded with supply. Too much wool coming out of England, and the price plummeted. The English now are desperate to find new markets for their wool, and they begin thinking about Asia. Like so many of the other groups we've talked about, their initial motivation for sailing out across the ocean to the west was hopes of reaching Asia. And so that's going to be one of their motivations as they begin to join this process of exploration. The English also now have for nearly a century been observing the Spanish and Portuguese who are coming from the New World with ships laden with gold and silver and riches on the backs of Indian labor and African slaves. And so the English are going to hope to follow that model. And we're going to talk about this in the very next lecture, the earliest English exploration. They are going to try to replicate what the Spanish did. Go over to the Americas, find gold, and start shipping it back to the homeland of England. As we will see, they're not successful in that regard, but that's their hope. There are others, finally, who are motivated by missionary zeal. They see in the New World a land that is just filled with heathen souls waiting to be converted. And so that's always going to be another motivation, always not far beneath the surface. So by the late 1500s, many English are ready to leave and strike out for adventure, heading to the New World, and they have the means to do it. There's one other factor involved in this, and that's the process of publicizing ways to make this voyage. And one of the most important figures in this process, actually two people with the same name, an uncle and a nephew named Richard Hakluyt, who wrote books and pamphlets publicizing the New World and advertising ways that people might make that voyage. According to Richard Hakluyt, there was glory, profit, and adventure awaiting for everyone who might be interested. For noblemen who might be second or third sons, there would be an opportunity to find lands, crops, and riches. For merchants, there were great opportunities for trade. For clergymen, there were huge masses of heathen souls waiting to be converted. And for the lower classes, there was plenty of land to start anew with farms and land of their own. So, in the late 1500s and early 1600s, Richard Hakluyt, the two of them, publicized and advertised this push to the New World. So by the end of the 16th century, the English have defeated the Spanish Armada and are a growing world power. The population is growing rapidly, and many of them are in need of land and jobs. Many English have seen or heard about the Spanish and Portuguese finding wealth and riches and dream of doing so on their own. Others are persecuted for their religious beliefs. And Richard Hakluyt, the two of them, are publicizing all of these developments and promoting English expansion. For all of these reasons, by the end of the 16th century, the English are ready and eager to join in the race to claim portions of the New World. It is there that we will pick up the story as we start our next chapter on English settlement in the Americas.